Good morning and welcome to Hudson Institute here in DC. We are a research organization primarily aimed to promote American leadership for a secure, free, and prosperous future. And my name is Jeremy Hunt, and I'm a media fellow here at the Institute. And today I'm honored to have Professor Jon Askonas here with us. And we're going to be discussing force design and adaptability for our U.S. military. And Professor Askonas is an assistant professor of politics at the Catholic University of America, where he works on the connections between the Republican tradition, technology, and national security. He is currently working on two books, A Muse of Fire, Why the U.S. Military Forgets What It Learns in War. And it also talks about what happens to wartime innovations when the war is over. And The Shot in the Dark, A History of the U.S. Army Asymmetric Warfare Group, the first comprehensive overview of a unit that helped the Army adapt to the post-9/11 era of counterinsurgency and global power competition. His writing has appeared in Russian Analytical Digest, Triple Helix, The New Atlantis, Fair Forward, War on the Rocks, and the Texas National Security Review. Well, thank you so much, Professor, for being here with us. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me on, Jeremy.
Yes. Well, I wanted to kind of kick things off by discussing really what you mean when you talk about force design and adaptability. For people at home, you've written a lot about the importance of this kind of organizational layer in the military, and just kind of want to hear what that means to you and why is it so significant?
Yeah. So when we think about our military organizations, we often think about the military units, right? The actual units that are. And my work has been primarily in the Army, but this holds true for the Air Force and the Navy as well, although there's some important differences between how those services organize themselves to achieve the combat power that they need to protect our country. We often focus on the units that are sort of on the front lines. But any sort of military expert or person with service experience will tell you that so much of what determines the effectiveness of those frontline organizations is the rest of what happens, right? The logistical train, how command and control for those units is organized, how those units task organize or reorganize themselves for the particular missions that they are called to perform. So my area of focus is on how the U.S. military actually adapts in wartime environments.
Amazing. And in a lot of your research, as you also taken kind of a historical perspective with a lot of this too. Do you mind kind of just walking us through just kind of roughly where we are today with this and kind of how things have changed over the last several years?
Yeah, sure. So the U.S. military is a tremendously adaptive organization, and it's transformed itself a number of times throughout its history. Beginning in the Second World War, we had what's called a cadre army, which we had a peacetime army that had military professionals, people whose careers were in the military, but not really what we'd call standing army, right? It was not prepared on day one to sort of fight and win. It wasn't designed to do that, right? It was designed that when the nation went to war, it would mobilize, it would draft or bring volunteers in large numbers into the force. That cadre army would be kind of the bones that would train and put muscle on, and then that's the force we would come take to war. That's how we now that's very different from the Navy, right? One of the reasons that navies and armies are different are historically, the size of armies would fluctuate dramatically depending on the character of the threat. Whereas the Navy, you can't just build a Navy on day one, right? You already have to have the Navy that you want to go to war with, largely. And so, I think this is one of the really important differences between the services. So, but there was no Department of Defense, right? You had the Department of War and you had the Department of the Navy. And it wasn't until after the Second World War that we created what today is the Department of Defense, which isn't just about, it's not just a container to hold the three services, right? The Air Force, Army, Navy, and then the Space Force as part of the Air Force, the Marine Corps as part of the Navy. The Defense Department also manages this pipeline of research and development and industry that keeps our military's technological edge sharp, and does a lot of other things too. So that's the kind of organization we come into the Cold War with. And throughout the Cold War, we also maintained for the first time a sort of a large standing army. There's massive demobilization after the Second World War, but then we remobilized to fight the Korean War, and then we maintain a mix of conscripts and drafts up through the Vietnam War, right? And the Vietnam War, unbelievably intensive, manpower intensive effort, fought over, roughly depending where you look at it, a 8-year period, 10-year period, that leads to the feeling that this kind of force structure isn't working for us anymore. It's not working. It's not working militarily. The quality of the conscripts who are being brought in is diminishing. It's not working socially, right? There's huge amounts of social unrest, both due to the unpopularity of the war, but also due to the unfairness of the draft, right? So, in the Second World War, there were exceptions to the draft, right? There were exceptions for people with sort of key civilian jobs. So my great uncle, for instance, ran a paper mill. He was exempt from the draft because it was deemed a strategic industry. But the number of people who fell under that exemption was very small, right? Well, as the United States prepares for kind of technological conflict in the 21st century or 20th century, it encourages more and more people to go to college. But it keeps this collegiate draft exception on the books. And so by the time you get to Vietnam, things look very different. Suddenly, there's a huge number of people who are exempt from the draft. Suddenly, it's very plausible if you want to get out of the draft, you don't want to go to Vietnam, for you to go to college. It's a lot easier to go to college. And so this is one of the things that creates this kind of social unrest. So, and again, this, by the way, the structural change we're talking about, I think, primarily affects the Army directly. The Navy and the Air Force, are primarily manned by volunteers. Although I think indirectly, right, one major source of volunteers for other services was people didn't want to join the Army and get sent to fight in the infantry in Vietnam. So we move after 1975 to what's called an all volunteer force, where everyone who joins the military has joined because they've volunteered for service. That's one really important change. Another important change, which is maybe more subtle, is the construction of a series of what are called combatant commands. So in World War II, in Korea, in Vietnam, when we went to war, we largely stood up new command structures just to prosecute those wars, right? Now, by the time you get to Vietnam, there is this thing called Pacific Command, but it's very important for some of the logistics in Vietnam, but it's not very operationally involved in Vietnam. Most of the important decisions are being made in MACV, which is the acronym for the command structure for Vietnam. Well, as we encounter global threats, and especially after in the 1980s and 1990s, as we are becoming less concerned about discrete big wars like Vietnam, like World War II, and more concerned about smaller, persistent security challenges all over the globe, we really begin to kind of supercharge this combatant command structure. So we're providing it more resources, more staff, so that we kind of always have expertise, planning, ability to act all over the world. And this is the kind of force structure that we take to Iraq and Afghanistan after 9/11. Now, in both places, there are command structures that have stood up that are actually kind of running the day-to-day aspects of the war. But this global command structure is one of the key factors that has enabled us to have persistent military operations all over the world, right? So, your average American is certainly aware of what we're doing, or, that we were in Iraq, that we were in Afghanistan. They might be aware that we've been in Syria, not directly fighting the Assad regime, but in pursuing ISIS in Syria. They're probably less aware of the kind of day-to-day drumbeat of military activity in literally over 100 countries all around the world, in training missions, in advisory and assistance, in now logistical assistance to the war in Ukraine, in all kinds of low-level missions that are usually not violent, but that contribute to American global military power.
And just one thing on that too is, when I was in the military, that was one of the coming home, when I was on leave, so many of my friends would be shocked to hear about just some of the types of deployments that people in the military are getting nowadays. During that time, everyone was thinking about Afghanistan or Iraq. But I had friends getting deployed to Djibouti, and so they were in AFRICOM and an African Command, and all over. So it really is, our forces really are, spread out quite a bit. And at that time, when I got deployed to Ukraine, that was even at that point was kind of seen of seen as something that, oh, that's interesting. That's not the Middle East. What's going on in Ukraine? We were, of course, training for what was then this kind of hypothetical threat of Putin launching an invasion against Ukraine. And so anyway, so I think that's such a good point to bring up, is just this kind of combatant command structure is so different from from what a lot of people kind of think about when you consider military service.
Absolutely, and that contributes to, again, if your focus is primarily on these big famous units, First Division, 101st Airborne, 75th Ranger Regiment, whatever, that's all you're thinking about. That those units haven't necessarily changed that much. I mean, the technology's changed, training's changed, whatever, but that structure hasn't changed that much historically. Right. But the context in which the structure operates has radically changed, right? So, as you know, most deployments today are not deploying a whole battalion or BCT, or much less a division, right? I can't remember. I mean, the last time we actually deployed a division was probably the invasion of Iraq in 2003, 20 years ago, right? But what we have instead is, because we have this combatant command structure, which can support staffing for these sort of task forces that can organize things and missions in the field, we'll take little pieces of enablers, of detachments of units, of companies, platoons, and deploy those kind of piecemeal to missions, right, as you said, like the Ukrainian Advise and Assist mission. Most Americans probably had no idea that from 2015 until early 2022, there was a steady rotation of Army, National Guard, and other enablers conducting advise and assist missions in Ukraine, training the Ukrainian army. Right, most people have no idea, but that's only yeah, that's right, at the battalion level or lower. Right, battalion would be the biggest deployment to that kind of a mission.
Right.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. And when I was there, we were a squadron, a CAV squadron, but even honestly less than that. It was basically a squadron light. That's how we would have described it.
Yep.
And me as a young second lieutenant, I was the forward S2, the intel officer there, and learned a lot there. Got my promotion to first lieutenant, and really enjoyed the experience there. And another thing too that was huge when I was in two is how, what you mentioned, like the kind of big famous units, they're now regionally aligned with each combatant command as well. And so the idea is that you would kind of study your whatever region you're aligned with. You kind of try to at least somewhat study the types of threat there. But the training sometimes isn't always so specific to the area that you're going in now. And I kind of want to talk about that a little bit, about the kind of training, because you've written a little bit about how you believe that the training should be specific to the threat that we are dealing with. And what are some of your thoughts on that end?
Well, yeah, so it's funny. We have this regionally aligned system now. And by the way, so this is officially stood up, I think, in 2014. It wasn't, I think you could easily get the impression that before 2014 there was no regional alignment, and that's not exactly true, right? There were particular units that had steady rotations to South Korea, to Germany. You had units, especially in the Army Special Forces. Special Forces groups historically have been aligned with particular regions. So one group does Latin America, one group does East Asia, one group does Middle East, but not for the kind of the big army, so to speak. And this is an Army policy, I believe, not I don't think this applies to Air Force and Navy. But one problem with the way that we kind of did it halfway, right? There's kind of halfway alignment, because that regional alignment would affect deployments, it would affect training on the margins, but we did not pursue allowing units to change their force structure, or changing the force structure of units to match the particular threats that they face in those regions, right? So, a BCT that's aligned with Europe, if the threat there is Russia, that needs a different. It's going to go to war. It would actually go to war with a different force structure than a BCT that was supporting, operations in the East Pacific, right? Or in East Asia, in the Pacific, right? Or in Africa. But we in our regional alignment, we did not take the step further and actually change our force structure, training, doctrine to specifically align particular units with threats. And there is a reason for that, which is when something big goes down, everybody's going to go. And I think there's this tension in American doctrine, and this goes to the problem of the all-volunteer force too, which is we want to have this regional approach, but we only have the force structure to do sort of small missions with that approach. And if there's a big thing that comes along, everybody's going to go. So then you would be taking, if you regionally aligned, I don't know, like 11th Stryker or something with East Asia, and then it has to go to Russia, then suddenly you're taking a unit which isn't prepared for its force structure to Russia. So there is a kind of logic in not regionally aligning that much. But I think there's a real tension here between our desire to have a one size fits all army and the need to actually adapt to the specific threats that we face.
Absolutely. And I wanted to talk to about your scholarship as a whole, dealing with force design, adaptability, and sometimes that's juxtaposed against some scholarship that's studying the culture in the Army. And so I kind of wanted to look at that a little bit more to understand kind of the differences between those two approaches.
Yeah, well, so there's a large literature on what's called service culture or strategic culture. Sometimes those aren't exactly the same, about the ways that we want to fight, and that then shape how we organize ourselves, how we think about ourselves. And there's some logic to this, right? The military service is embedded in our society, is embedded in our political institutions, and those are going to produce preferences which are sort of stable over time. So, for instance, our military historically has been more casualty averse than some other militaries, right? And that's makes sense, right? We have a military with, filled with our citizens. We think of them as citizens. They vote, their parents vote, their siblings vote. There's a political pressure against casualties. We have also tended to have a kind of industrialized and kind of high tech, high education, high training military, relative to maybe our competitors at any given moment in time. And so again, that tends to, you want to preserve this sort of precious resource. We're not going to be sending, the opposite would be like, the Russians at Stalingrad or the Japanese Banzai charges where it's just everybody's disposable. So there is something to this idea. However, I do think that we have historically, when you ask why didn't we change, why didn't we adapt, one reason that's often given is culture. There's some kind of cultural, internal, informal resistance to change. And I think this is largely overestimated. I think we hide a lot of process problems, a lot of personnel problems, a lot of incentive problems behind this idea of culture. Because if it's culture, then nobody's responsible and there's nothing we can do to change it. Whereas if it's about process or personnel or incentives, then we have to make hard decisions about, changing the institution as it currently exists, creating winners and losers. There's all kinds of other things that come along with that.
Yeah. And when you look at I kind of want to rewind back in time just a little bit to the you mentioned before about the advent of the all volunteer force in the 70s after the Vietnam War, and at that point, how do you think that affected our force design and our ability to adapt? Kind of how did that affect those parts that you're talking about, the policies, the people, and the type of programs that were in the Army at that time?
I mean, it was a definitive change, massive change. Impossible to underestimate how radical a change it was, because it did a number of things. The it changed who entered the Army, and for the first few years, like a lot of one of my controversial opinions the Army has this narrative about itself and the kind of malaise after the Vietnam War. And I think that a lot of what is attributed to demoralization after losing in Vietnam is actually the growing pains of the volunteer army. Because you think about, who wants to join the army in 1973, 1974, 1975, right? They're not getting the cream of the crop. They went to the all-volunteer force before they adjusted pay structure to actually be able to recruit people. So the pay was very bad. And so they were getting very low quality individuals, basically. And so low intelligence, low skill, low motivation, whatever. And it took them several years to develop, improve the pay, develop the kind of the institutions they needed. You need a lot more marketing and a lot better marketing for an all volunteer force than you do for a conscript force, right? So it took them a while. It took them several years to actually achieve this. It created a dilemma for the army, which was after Vietnam, they had one big mission, which was conventional deterrence of the Soviets in Europe. I say conventional deterrence because there were a number of political issues that made nuclear deterrence, just deterring them by saying, if you do anything, we're going to nuke you, less credible and therefore less effective. And so the idea is we need to actually have a force that can credibly fight on day one long enough to create escalation dynamics that would make a credible nuclear threat, which then paradoxically deters them from acting in the first place. So if you can credibly threaten that you're not going to win on day one or day two, you're not going to have a fiat accompli, then if you attack, you don't know what's going to happen. There's going to be a real brawl. It's long enough to mobilize conventional forces from the United States. We practiced this. We started a series of what were called reforger exercises, which were basically mobilization and deployment exercises to Europe. And in that whole process, the risk of nuclear escalation rises, exponentially. So there was this very particular tailored deterrence strategy, but they had to do it with this all-volunteer force, which is much smaller than historically you'd had in Europe, right? Because most of the force structure, the army goes from like 1 million people to 400,000 people, 450. And most of that force structure is coming out of Europe, right? And the army had already pulled a lot of forces out of Europe to fight in Vietnam. So what General Creighton Abrams and the chief of staff of the army, what they decided to do is basically maximize the tooth-to-tail ratio in the active force. So the active force is designed not to fight a long war, but so in the army, you have the army and the reserves, right? You have a much larger reserve of people whose primary day job is not being a soldier, but doing something else, and then they can be activated. So we're going to put all of the active force, as much combat power, short-term combat power in the active force so that we can fight on day one. And then we'll put everything we can in the reserves, right? And so this results in this massive imbalance in capability. So for example, something like 95% of Army civil affairs personnel are in the reserves. So when you go to fight like in Iraq, one of the reasons why there's such a mess in March, April of the invasion of Iraq, is the civil affairs personnel haven't been mobilized yet. So you go into war without the people who you want to take over and help take over right after you win. Just for one example. So this is one imbalance. The other really imbalance is then you have to rely on contractors, right? There's simply no model for an army. If you're putting all the tooth in the active force, that all the other little jobs that had been done by soldiers are going to be done by civilians. So you want every job that can be done by someone who's not a soldier to be done by someone who's not a soldier, so that everyone who you're getting the most bang for your buck with the small number of billets that Congress has allocated for you. Right.
But isn't there some danger there too, though? If you have the ratio between civilians and actual uniformed service members becomes just too high. I mean, if you look at the numbers now, it looks like in a few years we could get to a 1-to-1 ratio where we have a civilian to every one member in uniform. Aren't there some dangers on that end as well?
So I should clarify: civilians, and you have I'm not talking about government civilians. I'm talking about contractors. I'm sure we're already way over 1-to-1 ratio of contractors.
Right.
Particularly whenever we're doing anything abroad, right? A lot of the logistics is going to be contracted out. A lot of the services, like I'm sure when you were deployed, I'm sure your DFAC, your like dining facility, was run by not green suiters and probably not Americans.
Of course.
Yeah, well, you say of course, but that wasn't that case before the volunteer force.
Got it. And so your concerns are cabined by, as long as it's contractors and not fully relying so heavily on DoD civilians, so that you draw
DoD civilians is maybe a different problem. So I'm just talking about what are the effects of the all volunteer force. So
that makes sense.
You have these massive effects, and so today you have people complaining about contractors, and that's sort of that's what you get with the all volunteer force.
Yeah.
So the challenge, of course, today is, here's the problem: that what Creighton Abrams built was well designed for the specific strategic challenge that the United States faced of conventional deterrence in Europe, right? It was not designed as a Swiss Army knife. It was not designed for every kind of mission we might have. It was designed for one mission, and it achieved its purpose. We did not fix that after the Cold War, right? We never came along and thought, how do we redesign the force for the actual world we find ourselves in? Now, there have been brilliant, Army senior leaders who have done things to make the force more modular, to make the force more deployable, to tinker on the edges, regional alignment, but we've never had a kind of fundamental rethinking of the force structure. And the problem we face now is, we are looking to deter an adversary that is in many ways stronger than the Soviet Union, is more threatening than the Soviet Union, with in a global context in which there are other threats besides the Soviet Union, or besides China. I'm talking about China, with a force that's designed to do one thing, right? So, it's when we went to Iraq, what I think many Americans don't realize is we basically can't fight a war larger than Iraq on the all volunteer force, larger or more difficult or more costly than Iraq, right? Iraq, if you look at what happened with forced rotations, with stop loss measures, we basically used literally every trick in the book, short of, I'll just say we used every trick in the book to pull off the Iraq mission without any kind of deeper social mobilization. So anything bigger than Iraq won't work with this model. And we can already know that. We already do know that. And yet this has, in my mind, this should be a, 5-alarm fire. Like, we are facing global threats and we have a force structure, which we know will not work against those threats. So I think there's a huge amount of complacency about this right now.
Yeah, and not to mention the fact that we have a major recruitment crisis right now too. So
we couldn't do Iraq today. We simply could not do Iraq today. It's another thing that I think. I mean, the Air Force could, like, the first part. Yeah, we could invade Iraq. I don't think it would be as smooth as it was in 2003. By the way, if it happened today, for both because of the degrading in our capability, as well as new capabilities that I think have made it easier for a kind of adversary to fight in an asymmetric fashion. So we couldn't do Iraq today. And we have this recruiting crisis now, which is afflicting the Army especially.
Yes. One thing you've written quite a bit about is how this kind of practice where the Army will often kind of stand up these organizations tailored to whatever fight we might be in, but then kind of jettisons the organization once that particular conflict it comes to a conclusion. What are your thoughts on that, and why do we continue to see that dynamic, and what are the harms of that?
Yeah, well, I think I need to talk about the harms and the benefits. So this is the first book I'm writing on why the U.S. military forgets what it learns in war. And I argue that it's not really about doctrine. It's not really about culture. It's really about this process of demobilization. So we face new challenges. We build new organizations to address those challenges, whether they be task forces or, new stood up ad hoc organizations. And we're pretty good at actually meeting those challenges. And then because of the bureaucratic and budgetary drawdown after a war, those organizations get destroyed. That's what we saw in Iraq and in Vietnam. So, to use a recent example, pretty much all of the institutions which we built to do counterinsurgency, to understand this complex social environment, to do rapid technology adaptation, to counter the IED threat, they've all been destroyed at this point. And including the counterinsurgency academy at Fort Leavenworth, the asymmetric warfare group, right, which I'm also writing a book about, the rapid equipping force, the joint IED defeat organization. Could go on and on about these, not to mention the way we organize our general purpose forces, the way we reorganized units like the unit you were in to have much more intelligence personnel to handle the kind of the complex counterinsurgency environment. That's all changed and been basically forgotten. So this happens because skilled practice is expensive, right? Any military service is going to spend most of its time practicing, training, and you can only train in so many things. And the more you train, the better you are. And so if you don't want to spread your training out over a bunch of tasks that you don't expect to actually have to do, you want to focus your training on what is the next big threat that you're going to face. So I think there's something quite strategic about this. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing that we forget what we learned in war. I think you have to just look at what did we lose that we could actually would have been useful to retain, and what did we lose that's going to be really costly to re-achieve, right? So I think, for example, one thing that we really should not have done is shut down these technology procurement organizations like Rapid Equipping Force and Asymmetric Warfare Group, An asymmetric warfare group had this unique capacity to go to the very front line of battle with trained and ready personnel, not to fight, but to observe, to assist units there, to give them, guidance from experienced personnel, but then to actually see what was going on at the edge of the threat and bring that back into the Army's own kind of doctrine, concept, acquisitions processes, and help the Army adapt faster. That would have been so useful in Ukraine. And I've talked to any number of Army personnel, any number of people who work kind of inside defense acquisitions, and everyone has felt that this was a major mistake to shut down this organization. So those are just a couple of examples of what we might have retained.
Yeah. I want to talk to just kind of get your thoughts on. So we've kind of defined the problem. We talked about some of your your thoughts on where the Army's at now. I want to look at the future a little bit. What are some of the reforms that you would recommend if we want to make sure that we have a force structure that is going to be able to withstand it? And this is probably one of my last questions here as we're wrapping up. What do you think, as we look towards the future, what are those reform and kind of recommendations that you would make to our current force structure?
Well, I think the number one lesson from Cold War history is you have to adapt your force structure to the problems that you have, the threats that you have. And frankly, you need to be ruthless in that. And I think we have not been ruthless. I think one of the things we're seeing in Ukraine is that we have been very successful so far in building partner capacity, in using logistics and intelligence to really support our allies, and not just in Ukraine, but also presumptively in other parts of Europe. So I think we have a unique opportunity to address the Russian threat through these practices, intelligence, logistics, the arsenal democracy sort of approach, and encourage Europeans to further develop their own force structure, and then turn to the threat which is militarily significant, which is China. And frankly, we have an army, we have a Goldilocks problem. Our army is too small to really, it's too small as constituted to actually prosecute a war with these countries, but it's large enough that it's sucking a lot of resources away. So I think we should, particularly with the recruiting challenge, I think we ought to, my radical idea for reform would be to look at the cadre army approach again. Look at what can we do to retain professionals who are very skilled and experienced and who could rebuild an army from, in a mass kind of conscription and volunteer approach in case of a large war, and then use those resources to really bolster the Air Force and the Navy, which are going to be on the front lines of any kind of conflict with China. So, I think we have been, and then I think that, I won't speak to them, but the Navy and the Air Force, I think, have had significant problems as well, especially Navy surface warfare is just in a miserable shape, it seems, from people who know that area. We're not building enough submarines. So, I think we have to be ruthless. We need to adapt our force structure, not to hypothetical threats, not to some universal Swiss Army knife approach, but to the actual threats that we face. And we need to do it sooner rather than later because time is running short.
Absolutely. Wow. Well, thank you for that, and just for it's one thing that I think we need to be having more of these conversations just about force design as a whole, and where I think this is something that we need to talk more about, just not only just within the military, but also with Congress and everything, to make sure we're raising awareness, because we are we face serious threats abroad. And I just appreciate you, Professor, for being with us and sharing your expertise with us. And we're going to keep thinking about this, and we hope we can have you back another time. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jeremy.
Yes, and for those watching at home, please stay up to date with us. You can find all of our upcoming events at hudson.org, and we just appreciate you joining us today.